Romulus and Remus. The raft glided through the watery maze of underground tunnels. On deck, Shade lay crouched on all fours, shivering beside Marina. There was a red guard beside each of them. Sharp teeth closed lightly around their wings, just in case they tried to break free and fly.
"What are you staring at?"
One of the guards growled at Shade. Shade glanced away. He'd been looking at the rats, struck by how physically similar they were to him. He'd never noticed. Of course, he'd never been this close to rats before. Naturally, they were bigger. But if you imagined them with wings...
"Bad spies," said the chief guard with loathing.
"We're not spies,"
said Shade again warily.
"Tell it to the prince."
And the guard laughed unpleasantly, reveling in some secret joke. Gliding down the waterways, they passed more and more rats on the shores, their eyes flashing in the darkness. Human garbage bobbed in the water. Shade longed to fly away. Beyond the end of the tunnel, he could make out teeming movement. Rats, hundreds of them. Farther on was some kind of building. The water was shallower now, and Shade noticed that the rats on the sides of the draft were no longer swimming, but scrabbling along the bottom on all fours. The tunnel opened out into a much bigger space. High stone walls ran with sludge leaking from dozens of grates. Rats stood hunched at every opening, peering down at them. It seemed every surface was covered with rats. Underground, they writhed in the muck. The raft ground ashore.
"Move!"
The guards barked at Shade and Marina, their jaws tightening on their wings. Shade walked with difficulty through the mud, the swarm of rats parting to let them pass. The smell of them made him wince, his stomach lurching in disgust. He stumbled. Bats weren't meant to walk on all fours. The crowd jeered. They ground their teeth hungrily, a horrible, bone-scraping that sent Shade's fur on edge. He looked at Marina, spattered in grime, dragging her claws out of the sucking mud. They were drawing closer to some kind of rat palace, constructed of garbage. Squashed cartons and gnarled plastic and crinkled shiny paper. On a wide platform, high above the mud, slouched the biggest rat of all. His rolls of fat squished out from either side of his corpulent belly, and his teeth, when he showed them, were long and grooved and tarnished with old food.
"They are not kneeling," he said to the guards.
"Kneel before the prince,"
the chief guard shouted, batting their heads down.
"Do you know who I am?"
the fat rat asked. "The prince?" Marina offered after a pause.
"Guard!"
said the prince, and the rat beside Marina nipped the edge of her wing. She cried out.
"I won't tolerate insolence in my court,"
said the prince. He turned to the chief guard.
"How did they get inside?" "The far north grate, Prince Remus." "And why isn't it guarded? Who was on duty?"
"Crawl, your highness."
"Have him dismissed at once."
"He's disappeared, your highness."
"I won't tolerate this. Guards must keep on their posts at all times. Do you hear? We've got to be on guard at all times."
He turned his nervous eyes back to Shade and Marina.
"You're spies, aren't you?"
"No," said Shade.
"Send to gather information for a surprise attack."
Shade shook his head again.
"How dare you?"
bellowed the prince.
"How dare you mock me?"
The guard beside Shade ground his teeth threateningly.
"You think because my kingdom lies in the shadow of a mountain I'm cut off?"
His chest heaved with anger.
"You think I don't know what's going on up ground? I think you've joined forces with the birds."
Shade looked at Marina in alarm. What was he thinking about?
"Yes, that's right," said the prince, catching their look. "You're surprised at how much I know. I have reports. I'm kept abreast of everything."
He looked around at the assembled rats as if daring them to disagree.
"The king himself sends messengers to me."
His eyes snapped back to Shade and Marina.
"And I know about the vicious attacks you and your bird allies have been making at night. You've killed rats, and those squirrel and mice cousins too."
With a sickening jolt, Shade understood. He remembered the rats Goth had killed. How many, he couldn't say. And who knew how many more since they'd separated? The prince thought Goth and Throb were birds.
"Black owls, isn't it?"
said Prince Remus, saliva flying from his mouth. He looked up as if he expected one of them to plunge from overhead.
The black owls are your allies. Speak!
Shade didn't know what to say. The idea of bats allied with owls was crazy. It was impossible. But telling the truth was pointless. The prince would never believe him, and he didn't want to risk making him angrier than he already was.
Yes, your highness, said Shade.
The black owls have joined forces with a group of jungle bats. From the corner of his eye, Marina glanced quickly at him, but wouldn't turn to meet her gaze.
Jungle bats?
Remus jerked forward. He looked to the rats assembled around them, then to his chief guard.
Why haven't I heard about these jungle bats? How am I supposed to run my kingdom when no one informs me?
That's why we've come to you, your highness, Shade told him. He was inventing furiously, praying the words would keep flowing into his head. We wanted to let you know exactly what was going on. These bats come from the jungle, and have betrayed the rest of us by siding with the owls against bats and rats alike.
Jungle bats,
muttered Prince Remus to himself, as if he still couldn't understand how he hadn't heard about this. He looked at Shade suspiciously.
Who sent you?
Before he could form a reply, Marina spoke. The great bat elders of the mountain colonies, she told him. You're very well known in our kingdoms. Everyone knows the name of Prince Remus.
Of course they do,
the Red Prince said haughtily.
Of course they know me, and fear me, yes. Fear me and the might of my kingdom.
He paused and stared hard at Shade, and his eyes glinted with an intelligence Shade hadn't seen before.
It's very good of you bats to warn me.
Shade nodded, biding his time.
Very generous of you,
the prince said softly.
We didn't want there to be any misunderstanding.
Shade could feel a trickle of cold sweat slither through his fur.
These jungle bats are traitors. Our colonies want to keep the peace with you. Our colonies want to keep the peace with you.
The prince still stared at him, as if trying to bore into his head. Shade didn't dare to look away.
You're lying.
No, your highness!
This is a trap, isn't it? You're planning a surprise attack. Look around you. Do you see the number of soldiers I have here? Do you think you're the only ones with powerful friends? I am known to the king. I can ask for his help. I can summon our beast allies. Wild dogs, raccoons. Even the wolves will come up to the aid of Prince Remus. We can wipe you out.
Your highness, please. It was spinning apart.
I want to know the position of your forces.
I don't know. Shade's head was pushed down into the mud, brown ooze floating up his nostrils. He struggled wildly, but the guard's grip held him until he thought his chest would burst. He came up gagging.
Who sent you?
demanded the prince.
I told you, the great elders have... The prince shook his head. Take them to the drain, he told the guards, and drown them.
Fly! Shade shouted at Marina and spread his wings. But the red guards fastened their jaws around his forearm, and he knew if he tried to lift off, his arm would be ripped from its socket. Another guard had Marina's wingtip in his mouth, ready to tear. Shade sank back down into the mud.
Take them away, shouted the prince.
Bring them to me first.
The terrible shrieking voice issued from one of the many grates high in the wall. A dreadful silence fell over the mob in the palace courtyard, and Shade could tell they were all afraid of that voice. And that made him afraid too. He looked at the prince, and even he seemed taken aback.
I want to see them, Remus,
came the voice again. Shade tried to get a fix on it, and high up in the wall, he caught a blur of silvery movement from behind a set of metal bars. What was up there? What kind of animal made a noise like that? He couldn't decide which was worse, being drowned, or being taken to the owner of that unearthly voice.
Take them,
Prince Remus snapped at the guards, and then smiled grimly.
Let him do what he will, and then bring them back to me, if they're still alive.
The red guards led them up a series of steeply sloping tunnels. Hollowed out by rats rather than humans, they were muddy and lumpy, globs of filth dripping from the ceiling. Shade peered down the innumerable side passages, trying desperately to think of an escape plan. He was exhausted already by the long climb, his breath ragged, limbs aching. There was no way they could outrun the rats, not in this muck.
Here,
Chief Guard said, stopping them beside a large stone. Several of the rats put their shoulders to the stone and pushed. Slowly it slid across the mud, revealing a low opening in the oozing wall. Shade did not want to look inside. Even the guards seemed ill at ease, their whiskers twitching, casting worried glances at the chief.
Take them in,
the chief instructed 2 of the rats.
I want them alone,
said the shrill, unearthly voice cried from the darkness. The chief guard nodded, relieved, and the rats began prodding Shade and Marina toward the entrance. Shade tried to dig his claws in, but the mud offered no support, and immediately slid on his belly through the opening. Marina right behind.
Roll back the stone,
the voice instructed. As the stone was quickly being pushed back into place, Shade fearfully cast a sonic eye around the chamber. At one end you could see the grate that overlooked the rat palace, and sprawled to one side was the owner of the voice. It was a rat, large and hunched, not as fat as Prince Remus, but imposing nonetheless. Shade was almost relieved. He didn't know quite what he'd imagined, but it was certainly worse than this.
I've waited a long time for an opportunity like this,
said the rat hungrily, shifting himself onto his feet and sniffing forward a little. Shade stiffened, drawing closer to Marina. He could feel his heart pounding, his muscles tightening, and he knew there was still some fight left in him.
Very clever what you did down there,
the rat said.
I thought you were going to get away with it, playing on the prince's paranoia and flattering him at the same time. Very nicely done. I'm amazed he caught on, really.
Shade said nothing, watching the rat, ready to fight if he should suddenly lunge. He didn't sound like the other rats. He sounded... that was it? Almost like a bat.
His kingdom's in ruins,
the rat went on.
He has almost no idea what's going on up ground, because his messengers are unreliable, and his guards are forever deserting him to go to better kingdoms. The king despises him and tells him nothing. He lives in constant fear of attack, from birds, from bats. He's even afraid of me, and I'm his brother. My name's Romulus.
If he was the prince's brother, thought Shade, what was he doing sealed behind a stone like some sort of monster?
I can see you're confused,
Romulus said.
You see, the rumor is, I'm insane.
He giggled heartily.
I'm not fit to rule. I'm a freak. That's what Remus tells everyone. So I'm kept up here, out of sight, out of the way. I'm the oldest, and by rights I should be prince. And the only way Remus could get power was by imprisoning me and spreading stories about me.
The rat took another few steps closer, and Shade instinctively lowered his head, bared his teeth, and hissed. Romulus struck back in alarm.
I don't want to eat you,
he whispered indignantly.
Is that what you thought?
It did occur to us, Marina muttered.
Why did you bring us here?
Shade demanded. He didn't know what to make of the strange rat. He glanced at the stone barrier, knowing that on the other side the guards were waiting to take them to the drain, if they came out alive.
Don't worry about them,
Romulus told him.
They can't hear a thing, and they don't dare disturb me.
He paused.
I know you're not spies.
You do?
I know why you came down here. You were being hunted.
How do you know? Marina asked.
I saw it. I saw the 2 giant bats who were chasing you. I was outside in a human's town when you flew down into the grate. I've seen the world, you know, believe it or not.
He gestured around the dank chamber.
I've not spent my whole life here, but it's been a long time since anything this exciting has happened, I can tell you. And I never thought I'd get a chance to see you up close.
What do you mean? Shade asked.
Bats! I've seen quite a few from a distance, but never close enough.
His whisker twitched excitedly.
I have a special interest in bats, and... may I see your wings?
Shade was beginning to wonder if Romulus was crazy after all.
I'll stay back here, I promise.
Shade looked doubtfully at Marina, but for some reason he wasn't afraid of Romulus anymore. He didn't understand why the red wanted to see his wings, but there was an innocent excitement in his eyes, a burning curiosity, which made Shade trust him. "All right," he said. He unfurled his wings. Romulus stayed where he was, peering intently at the taut leather.
Could you lift them just a... Yes, thank you. And now angle them. Ah, yes,
he said, grunting to himself, muttering words Shade couldn't make out. After a few minutes, he nodded.
Thank you,
he said.
You can't know how important this is to me. Maybe if I showed you. Look!
Now he lay down in the mud and stretched out his arms and legs as far as they could go. Shade gasped. For although this creature was clearly a rat, there were long webs of skin between his arms and his hind legs, almost the same leathery material bat wings were made of. More folds of skin stretched between his feet and stubby tail. And, if we looked closely, there were even flaps of membrane between his neck and arms.
Wings!
Shade breathed in amazement.
You can see why my brother thinks of me as a freak,
Romulus said.
To him, I'm scarcely a rat at all.
Shade turned to Marina. I had a feeling. On the raft I was looking at the rats and I thought, really, with wings, we looked sort of the same. And maybe that explained Romulus' voice too, that strange bat-like shriek of his.
We're related, I think,
said Romulus.
I think that millions of years back we were the same creature.
He rustled the taut flaps of skin between his arms and legs.
And I think these are memories. Lost secrets that just happen to find their way out in me. I spent a lot of time outside. Years of my life studying this.
He stood.
Of course, I could be wrong. It's just a theory. Another popular one in my brother's court, as you might imagine. If he didn't think I was crazy, I'm sure he'd have drowned me years ago. Being a freak has its benefits, I can assure you.
Shade was silent for a moment, trying to digest all this. To think they could be related to rats.
Strange we should now be enemies, isn't it?
Said Romulus. Shade nodded. Those big bats you saw, the ones chasing us, they really are from the jungle. They're the ones who've been killing rats. We can't stop them.
Somebody must,
said Romulus.
Before they start a war between all the creatures.
Might be too late for that, said Marina. Anyway, we've got enough to worry about. How are we going to get out of here?
That,
said Romulus with a grin,
is easily taken care of.
He shuffled to a wall of his chamber and began to dig through the mud with his front claws, kicking out a pile behind him. After a few minutes, he'd exposed a narrow tunnel.
How else do you think I get outside so frequently?
He said.
Follow this. It should take you to the outskirts of the humans' town. You'll have to crawl, I'm afraid. A little undignified, perhaps, for bats, but a small price to pay for your lives. My brother's not known for his mercy.
What will you tell him? Shade asked.
I'll tell him I ate you both, right down to the marrow.
Thank you, said Shade.
Maybe,
said Romulus,
the three of us will meet again one day. Under better circumstances.